The morning sun came up over the scrub hills like a burnished coin, spilling light across the hard ridges and into the valley where Jake Hollister's ranch sat quiet as a prayer. The cattle lowed soft in their pens, windmill blades groaned, and the smell of dry sage drifted through the air. Jake leaned against the fence rail, hat pulled low over his brow, calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm. He'd been up before the dawn as always, mending the east fence, tending to the herd, moving through chores with a rhythm born from years of solitude. He'd lived 29 years under the same stretch of sky, and in all that time the only warmth he'd ever known came from campfires and sunrises. Folks in town said he was a good man, quiet and dependable, but there was a distance in his eyes, like he stood just a little apart from everything alive. He'd never been one for women. Not because he didn't notice them. He did, in that shy, uncertain way a man might notice rain after a drought, but because he never knew what to say, how to stand, how to look without feeling clumsy. His ma had died when he was young. His pa was a hard man who didn't believe in gentleness, and Jake had grown up believing love was a word for storybooks, not the dry plains. He'd seen ranch hands ride through town chasing saloon girls boasting about nights and whiskey, but none of it sat right with him. He wanted something quiet, real, the kind of feeling that didn't need to be shouted over piano music and laughter. Only he didn't think that kind of love existed for men like him. That morning, while he tightened the last length of barbed wire along the southern pasture, he caught sight of her. She was out by the Johnsons' field, halfway between his land and theirs, her figure small against the rising light. He paused without meaning to, one gloved hand still gripping the fence post. She moved like someone who'd grown up in the dust, steady, sure-footed, not afraid of work. Her hair was the color of sunlit wheat, pulled back under a worn hat, and her dress, though simple, swung around her calves when the wind caught it. He'd seen her before, of course. Everybody in town knew Ellie Carver, the girl who did a man's work without complaint. Her pa had died 2 winters back, leaving her to tend the small ranch alone. Some said she was stubborn as a mule. Others said she was too pretty for her own good. Jake only knew she had eyes that looked like open sky, clear, bright, and honest. She was fixing a gate when the post gave way, and before he even thought about it, he was striding over, boots crunching on gravel. "Need a hand?" he asked, voice lower than he meant it to be. She looked up, startled, then smiled a little, that quick, unguarded kind of smile that makes a man forget what he was saying. "Wouldn't say no," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Together they worked in silence for a bit, their hands moving over tools and wood, the sound of nails and wind filling the space between them. Every now and then their fingers brushed, and each time, Jake felt something flicker in his chest, something small but steady, like a flame catching. When the gate was done, Ellie leaned against the post and looked at him with a hint of amusement. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said. He adjusted his hat, suddenly aware of the dust on his shirt. "Ain't got much worth saying, I guess." She laughed softly. "Maybe. But sometimes it's the quiet ones who've got the most to tell. They just don't know how." He didn't know what to do with that, so he just nodded, feeling awkward and grateful all at once. She waved as she went back toward her land, and Jake watched her go until the horizon swallowed her up. For the rest of the day, every time the wind carried the scent of sage, he thought he caught a trace of her too, that light, impossible feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something he didn't even know he was missing. That evening, after supper, he sat on the porch of his small cabin, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The sky was all fire and gold, the kind of sunset that made the world look softer than it really was. He thought of Ellie again, her laughter, the dust on her hands, the way her voice lingered like a melody after she'd gone. It stirred something in him that felt both new and ancient. He'd never touched a woman, never even held one's hand, but that day had taught him that love might not start with a kiss. It might start with a shared silence, with the way 2 people fix a broken thing together and leave a little of themselves behind in the mending. As the stars blinked awake above the plains, Jake found himself whispering her name into the dark, almost as if saying it might summon her. "Ellie!" It wasn't a plea, just a thought carried on the wind. Maybe tomorrow he'd ride into town, find an excuse to see her again. Maybe he'd buy her a jar of honey from Mrs. Lang's store. He'd heard she liked honey with her biscuits. It was a foolish thought, maybe, but for the first time in his life, foolish didn't feel so bad. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the night settle around him. Somewhere out there, beneath the same stars, was the girl with wheat gold hair and laughter that could make a quiet man forget his loneliness. And though he didn't know it yet, that same girl was sitting by her own porch looking toward his ranch, wondering if the shy cowboy with the gentle hands would come by again. The following days rolled by like they always did, sunup to sundown, each hour marked by the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of work. But for Jake, everything seemed a little different. He woke before dawn with a strange kind of restlessness, the kind that made him linger by the mirror longer than usual, wondering if he should shave or if the stubble made him look older. When he saddled his horse, he found himself glancing down the trail toward the Carver Ranch, half expecting to see Ellie riding out for supplies or driving her small herd through the canyon. It was foolish, he told himself. They'd barely spoken. But something in that single morning's meeting had shifted the world's weight inside him. He saw her again 2 days later at the feed store in town. The street was bright with noon light, dust hanging in the air as wagons rattled past and folks called to one another. Jake had gone in for nails and saddle oil, but when he stepped out onto the boardwalk and saw her coming up the street, carrying a basket of flour and coffee beans, his heart gave a slow, unfamiliar kick. She wore the same hat as before, the brim frayed a little and her cheeks were pink from the sun. She spotted him almost immediately, and that smile, the one that made him forget his name, and appeared again. "Well, if it ain't the man who fixes gates faster than a preacher talks," she teased, stopping beside him. He tried to smile, tugging at his hat brim. "Guess I like things that stay shut when they're supposed to." "Then I hope you don't mind helping me again," she said, holding out the basket. "Can't get my wagon started. Mule's being stubborn." They walked together down to where her wagon sat near the livery, the mule indeed standing with a look of deep disapproval. Jake chuckled low, kneeling to adjust the harness, his hand steady even as his heartbeat wasn't. Ellie crouched beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint sweetness of her, soap and hay and something like lilac. "You always this helpful?" she asked, watching him. He didn't look up, afraid she'd see what was in his eyes. "Only when I get asked real nice." That earned him a laugh, light and genuine. It startled him. Not her laughter, but the way it stirred something easy in him, the way it made him want to hear it again. Once the mule started moving, she turned to him, brushing her hands on her skirt. "You ride this way often?" "Sometimes. Fence runs close to your land." "Then maybe you'll stop by sometime," she said, her tone casual but her eyes not. "Always room for another pair of hands, or company if you ever get tired of listening to your cattle." He hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe I will," he did, more than once. Over the next few weeks, he found excuses to ride past her place, bringing tools or extra feed, helping patch roofs or mend a gate that didn't truly need mending. Ellie never said no. Sometimes she'd bring him lemonade, or they'd sit on the porch and talk, or not talk, which came just as easy. Jake wasn't used to words, but Ellie seemed to understand the language of silence better than most. When they worked together, there was something peaceful between them, something that didn't need explaining. One afternoon, after they finished loading hay into her barn, they sat side by side on the fence rail, watching the sun sink over the far hills. The air smelled of dust and clover. Ellie kicked her boots idly against the wood, glancing at him. "You ever been married, Jake?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Ain't never found anyone who'd have me." She studied him, brow furrowing slightly. "Hard to believe. You seem decent, kind." He gave a faint, shy smile. "Kind don't count for much out here. Ain't much of a talker either." "I noticed," she said, a little grin playing on her lips. "But that's all right. Talkin's easy. Listening's rare." They sat quiet for a long while after that, until the wind came up and swept her hair loose from its braid. Without thinking, he reached out, gently brushing it back behind her ear. The touch was soft, brief, but it felt like the world stopped turning for a heartbeat. Ellie froze too, her eyes lifting to meet his. There wasn't fear in them, only something tender and searching. Jake's hand dropped away and he looked out over the horizon, his chest tight with emotions he didn't have a name for. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Didn't mean—" "Don't be," she interrupted softly. Sometimes it's nice when someone remembers you're not made of stone." He turned to her then, really looking. She smiled again, small but sure. And for the first time in his life, Jake Hollister felt what it meant to want someone not out of loneliness, but because they made the air itself feel alive. That night, when he rode home beneath a silver moon, his hands trembled on the reins. He'd never touched a woman before that evening, not even by accident, but the memory of brushing her hair stayed with him like the warmth of firelight on skin. He didn't know if it was love, not yet, but it was something close, something growing quiet and steady like spring grass after rain. Over the following days, Ellie began showing up at his ranch, bringing baskets of eggs or a loaf of cornbread as thanks for his help. She'd linger longer each time, asking about his horses, teasing him gently when he blushed under her gaze. Once she told him, "You're different from most men, Jake. You don't look at me like you're trying to figure me out. You just see me." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just smiled, which made her laugh again. That laugh he'd come to think might be the finest sound in the whole territory. For Ellie, too, something was changing. She'd spent so long being tough and self-reliant that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care, not because she needed saving, but because she mattered. Jake wasn't like other cowboys who swaggered and joked and tried too hard. He moved through life with a quiet gentleness, a steady presence that made her feel safe in a world that rarely was. By the time the harvest moon rose over the valley, it had become a small unspoken truth between them. She waited for his visits, and he came because his heart wouldn't let him stay away. And though neither had said the word aloud yet, love had already taken root, slow, deep, and true as the prairie itself. Autumn settled over the valley like an old quilt, golden light spilling across the meadows, crisp wind sighing through the cottonwoods, and the smell of rain coming up from the earth. For Jake Hollister, the days had begun to take on a rhythm that felt almost like happiness. He rose early, tended his herd, and by afternoon found himself glancing toward the hills that separated his ranch from Ellie's. Sometimes she'd ride out to meet him halfway, her bay mare kicking up dust, hair flying behind her hat brim. Other times he'd see her waiting at her gate, waving as he rode up with that shy smile that always undid him. They had fallen into a pattern neither dared to name, shared meals on her porch, laughter over coffee, small touches that lingered longer each time. The townsfolk had begun to notice too. Mrs. Lang, who ran the general store, winked at Jake one morning when he bought 2 jars of preserves instead of 1. "You tell that Carver girl she's got herself a fine man," she'd said, and Jake had nearly dropped the jars in embarrassment. It wasn't that he didn't want people to know. It was just fragile, what they had. Like a flame you had to cup your hands around when the wind blew too strong. He'd never been in love before, didn't know the rules or the words. Every time he looked at Ellie, he felt both brave and scared, like he was standing on the edge of something too beautiful to touch. One afternoon, clouds rolled in heavy and low, turning the horizon black. Ellie had been helping him drive cattle up from the lower pasture when the first crack of thunder split the sky. The herd spooked, scattering toward the ravine. Jake shouted, trying to steady them, but a sudden flash of lightning sent one steer bolting straight toward Ellie. She froze, the horse rearing, and before he could think, Jake was there, grabbing her reins, yanking her out of the way just as the animal thundered past. They both went down hard into the mud. When the storm finally passed, they sat there, in the rain, soaked and shaking, breath coming in short bursts. Jake reached for her hand, trembling. "You all right?" Ellie nodded, though tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "You could have been killed, Jake." He shook his head, mud dripping from his hat brim. "Couldn't let nothing happen to you." Something in the way he said it, quiet, raw, broke the last of the walls between them. Ellie leaned forward and kissed him, her fingers curling against his jaw, soft and trembling. It was the gentlest thing Jake had ever known. He didn't move at first, too stunned by the warmth, the taste of rain and salt and everything he'd ever wanted but never dared to dream. Then, slowly, he kissed her back. Not with hunger, but with reverence, as if afraid she might vanish if he pressed too hard. When they finally pulled apart, Ellie laughed breathlessly, her forehead against his. "Guess I started that," she whispered. Jake smiled, shy and wide-eyed. "Don't hear me complainin'." They rode back to her place in silence, both too full of emotion to speak. Inside her small kitchen, she handed him a towel, and when their fingers brushed, he caught her hand and held it, really held it, for the first time. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm, and he thought how strange and beautiful it was that two rough lives could fit together so easily. From that night on, they didn't need to pretend anymore. Jake started spending more evenings at her ranch, fixing whatever needed fixing, eating supper with her under the glow of an oil lamp. Sometimes she'd hum a tune while she cooked, and he'd sit by the fire just watching her. Other times she'd sit beside him on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder while the crickets sang. But the frontier wasn't a place that let joy go untested. Word of their closeness traveled fast, and not everyone approved. A ranch hand from the neighboring spread, a man named Warren Tate, had been calling on Ellie before Jake ever met her. He was loud, proud, and didn't take kindly to being ignored. One afternoon he rode up to Jake's place, spurs jangling, face hard. "You think you're something, Hollister?" he spat. "Think you can just steal a woman right out from under me?" Jake didn't rise to it. "Ain't stealing nothin'. Ellie makes her own choices." "Then maybe she needs reminding what kind of man she's keeping company with." Warren growled, spitting in the dirt. "A loner who don't know how to treat a woman." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't swing. Not because he was afraid, but because Ellie had once told him she hated fighting. "Go home, Tate," he said evenly. "Ain't nothing for you here." Warren laughed and rode off, but Jake could feel trouble simmering. That night he told Ellie what had happened. Her face went pale and she gripped his arm. "He's dangerous, Jake. He doesn't like losing." Jake smiled softly. "Neither do I. But I ain't losing you." That was the night she finally told him everything. About her father's death, the debt she'd inherited, the night she'd gone hungry to keep the ranch alive. "I'm tired of being strong all the time," she whispered, voice breaking. "Tired of fighting alone." Jake pulled her close, his rough hand cupping her cheek. "You ain't alone anymore, Ellie. Not ever again." She wept quietly against him, and he held her, heart full and aching. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The man who'd once believed he wasn't made for love realized he'd been wrong. Love wasn't about knowing what to say or do. It was about showing up, steady and unshaken, when someone else's world was falling apart. Outside, the wind howled through the hills, but inside that little cabin, warmth bloomed. Fragile, yes, but real. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew it in their bones. They'd found something worth holding on to, no matter what storms might come next. Winter came early that year, rolling down from the mountains with bitter winds and skies the color of old tin. The grass turned brittle, the rivers froze thin along their edges, and every morning the ranch roofs gleamed white with frost. Jake and Ellie worked side by side through it all, moving the cattle to shelter, repairing the barn against the cold, their breath fogging in the air. There was comfort in the routine, in the rhythm they'd built together, a kind of quiet promise that no matter how harsh the season, they'd weather it hand in hand, but peace in the West never lasted long. One afternoon, while Jake was out cutting wood on the north ridge, he saw smoke rising from Ellie's property. His stomach clenched, the axe falling from his grip. He ran for his horse, urging it hard across the frozen field. By the time he reached her ranch, the barn was half engulfed in flames, the orange light tearing through the smoke, the sound of animals crying out inside. Ellie stood near the well, pale and trembling, a bucket in her hands. "They're still in there," she shouted, voice raw. "The horses." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed a blanket, drenched it in the trough, and plunged into the fire. Heat clawed at his skin. Smoke stung his eyes, but he pushed through, leading the terrified animals out one by one. Ellie was right beside him, her dress blackened with soot, coughing but unyielding. By the time the last horse stumbled free, the roof had started to collapse. Jake pulled her back just as the timbers fell, showering sparks into the snow. They stood there together, shaking and filthy, the fire hissing as snow melted into steam. Ellie turned to him, eyes wide with horror. "It was him, Jake. I saw him. Warren Tate." He lit it and rode off toward the canyon. Rage flared through Jake like nothing he'd ever felt before. He'd been quiet all his life, slow to anger, but this was different. This was someone hurting the woman he loved. "Stay here," he said tightly, swinging into the saddle. "I'll take care of it." "Jake, don't!" she cried, grabbing his arm. Please, he's not worth it. But he was already gone, the horse tearing across the frozen plain, hooves pounding like thunder. The wind howled in his ears and the cold bit deep, but all he could see was the fire reflected in Ellie's eyes, the fear, the pain. He found Warren near the canyon rim, dismounting by a stand of mesquite. The man turned, smirking when he saw Jake. Told you she'd remember what kind of man you are. Jake's jaw tightened. You near killed her. She's fine. Barns can be rebuilt. But maybe now she'll think twice before setting her sights on a fool who don't even know how to fight for what's his. That was the last straw. Jake swung hard, his fist connecting with Warren's jaw. The two men grappled in the snow, boots sliding on the icy ground, grunts filling the air. Warren was bigger, meaner, fueled by spite, but Jake was fueled by something stronger. Love. He fought with the quiet fury of a man who'd never raised his hand before, but would do anything to protect the one person who gave him hope. The fight ended when Warren stumbled backward, his foot catching on a rock, tumbling down the embankment. He landed hard, groaning but alive. Jake stood at the edge, chest heaving, fists shaking. Don't come near her again, he warned, voice low and trembling. You do, and I won't stop at a warning next time. Then he turned and rode home, the fury draining from him, leaving only exhaustion and fear. When he reached Ellie's place, she was waiting on the porch, her eyes wide with relief and worry. Jake, she cried, running to him. You're bleeding. He caught her in his arms before she could finish, pulling her close, pressing his forehead against hers. Don't you ever scare me like that again, he whispered hoarsely. I can't lose you, Ellie, I can't. She clung to him, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. You won't, I promise. For a long time they just stood there, holding each other while the snow fell around them, the fire dying behind. Jake realized then that love wasn't just sweetness or laughter. It was this, standing in the ruins together, refusing to let go. In the days that followed, word spread about what happened. Folks in town offered help, lumber, hay, hands for rebuilding. Even the sheriff came by, tipping his hat to Jake. You did right, he said simply. Warren had left town, humiliated and half-broken, and no one seemed sorry to see him go. Through the long, cold weeks that followed, Jake and Ellie rebuilt the barn together, beam by beam. Sometimes their hands brushed. Sometimes they stopped working just to smile at each other across the half-finished frame. Every nail driven felt like a vow, a promise that what the fire took they'd build back stronger. One evening, after the last of the new boards were laid, Jake stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. The sky above was painted in pink and gold, the valley glowing with quiet peace. Ellie came up beside him, resting her hand on his arm. We did it, she said softly. He nodded, eyes still on the barn. We did. She turned to him then, expression gentle. You've done more than fix fences and fight off trouble, Jake. You've given me my home back, not just the land, but what it feels like to belong. Her words hit him harder than any blow ever could. He turned toward her, his voice rough. Ellie, you're the reason I wake up looking forward to the day. You're the reason I ain't afraid no more. She smiled, eyes bright. Then I guess we're both each other's reason. They kissed again, slower this time, without fear or hesitation. The air around them smelled of pine and snow, and the barn behind them stood proud and whole, a symbol of what they'd built from ashes. For the first time in his life, Jake Hollister knew what it meant to truly touch a woman, not just with his hands, but with his heart. Spring came soft and slow to the plains, like forgiveness after a long silence. The snow melted into shining creeks, the grass pushed green shoots through the thawed earth, and the air began to smell of rain and promise again. Jake Hollister's ranch came alive with it. The low of calves, the hum of bees in the clover, the sound of Ellie's laughter drifting across the yard like music he never wanted to stop hearing. It had been 3 months since the fire, and everything had changed. Where ashes once lay, now stood a bright new barn, sturdy, clean, smelling of fresh-cut pine. Jake had built a small fence garden beside it, where Ellie planted wildflowers and herbs, her hands working the soil with the same tenderness she gave to everything in her care. Some evenings, when the sun went down, they'd sit on the porch together, her head against his shoulder, the light painting the hills in gold. Those were the moments Jake treasured most, the quiet ones, when the world felt still enough that he could almost hear her heartbeat through his shirt. He'd never imagined himself the kind of man who could be happy. For most of his life, he'd thought happiness was for others, for men who knew how to laugh easily, or dance, or charm women with the right words. But Ellie had taught him that love wasn't about any of that. It was about showing up, about kindness in the smallest things, the way she brushed the dirt from his hands after a long day, the way he poured her coffee before sunrise. Love was work, and warmth, and forgiveness all tangled together in the same heartbeat. One morning, she found him in the barn brushing down his horse, the light falling soft through the rafters. "You've been quiet today," she said, leaning against the doorframe, her smile teasing. "What's rattling around in that head of yours, cowboy?" He turned, shy grin tugging at his lips. "Just thinking how lucky I am." She walked closer, her boots crunching in the straw. "Lucky?" "Yeah," he said, setting the brush aside. "Spent near 30 years thinking love wasn't meant for me, that maybe I'd been built for work, not for this." His gaze softened as it met hers. "Then you came along, stubborn as a mule and twice as pretty, and proved me wrong." Ellie laughed, the sound like sunlight. "You sure know how to make a girl blush." He took her hand then, rough thumb tracing her knuckles. "Ain't trying to make you blush, darlin'. Just telling the truth." She squeezed his fingers gently, then reached up to touch his cheek. "You're a good man, Jake Hollister. Better than most who've ever walked this town. You've got a heart bigger than the prairie." He ducked his head, embarrassed, but her words settled deep inside him. For a man who'd once thought himself empty, it was strange and beautiful to feel full of so much. That summer, they rode into town together more often, side by side, folks tipping their hats as they passed. The gossips who once whispered now smiled instead, calling them the Hollisters though they weren't yet married. Jake would always blush at that, but Ellie only grinned wider, pretending not to notice. She liked the sound of it, and truth be told, so did he. One golden evening after they'd finished supper and the crickets had begun their slow song, Jake stood from his chair and disappeared into the barn for a moment. When he came back, Ellie was on the porch, humming softly, her bare feet tucked beneath her dress. He knelt down in front of her, holding out something small in his calloused hand, a ring simple but shining, shaped from a silver horseshoe nail. She stared at it, then at him, her breath catching. "Jake." He smiled, eyes bright in the lamplight. "Ain't fancy, but it's honest. I can't promise much, no fine house or silks. But I can promise you this ranch, this life, and everything I've got inside me." Her eyes filled, and she cupped his face in both hands. "Jake Hollister, you fool. That's all I ever wanted." He slipped the ring onto her finger, hands shaking, and she leaned in to kiss him, soft, slow, and certain. Somewhere in the trees, a whippoorwill sang, and the stars came out one by one. They married a week later, right there on the ranch, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The preacher rode in from town, a handful of neighbors gathered, and Ellie wore a white dress she'd sewn herself. When Jake said, "I do," his voice broke halfway through, and she laughed through her tears. Afterward, they danced barefoot in the dust, the world spinning slow around them. Years passed. The ranch grew, the seasons turned, and their love only deepened. On long summer days they worked the land together. On cold winter nights, they sat by the fire, trading stories and laughter. Sometimes Jake would catch her looking at him with that same soft wonder she'd had the first time he brushed her hair behind her ear. Every time it undid him. He'd never stopped being a quiet man, but his silence had changed. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. And Ellie, in her own way, understood that. She'd lean against him in the evenings and say, "You don't have to talk, Jake. I can hear you just fine." He'd smile and press a kiss to her hair. "Reckon I can hear you too." One late afternoon, years later, he stood at the same fence line where he'd first seen her, the one where the sky broke wide open and everything in him had begun to change. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of sage. Behind him, Ellie called from the porch, "Jake, supper's ready." He turned, watching her silhouette in the fading light. the woman who'd taught him what it meant to be alive. And as he walked toward her, boots stirring dust in the golden air, he thought about all the things he'd never believed in. Luck, love, second chances. Turns out he'd been wrong about them all, because sometimes out in a hard and lonely world, a man spends half his life learning what it means to survive, and the other half learning what it means to be loved. And for Jake Hollister, that lesson had come not from the hands of fortune, but from the touch of a woman who'd shown him, at last, what love really feels like.